So our next talk is by Joel Isaac.
I should start by just saying a couple of things. First of all, I just want to thank Alan and Sander for inviting me. I hope you don't regret it. And also for all of the organization. Thanks to Janet, too, for arranging 3 days of what look like will be and already have been remarkable discussions. The other thing I want to say is, as you can tell, I have no slides. Apologies for the breach of etiquette. Maybe you can just close your eyes or admire the beautiful interior architecture. Don't look at me, please. You know, just look at the board. I don't know. All right. So I just want to say a few things before I get going about what this paper is. I guess the first thing I want to say is that this is intended as a contribution to the history of the philosophy of the social sciences. So maybe not hopos, but hopos. I'm not sure that's the right way of saying it. But that's kind of, I'm an intellectual historian, and that's the kind of tenor of this paper. The other thing to say is that this paper is kind of the beginning of a study of a study I want to undertake of the impact of decision theory on philosophy after World War II. I think that there's a really extensive and I hope quite interesting history to be told there. And this is kind of intended as a beginning down payment or a very rough sketch of that project. So in a sense, I'm very eager for discussion and comments as to how I might take this further, if it does indeed seem interesting. The last thing I'll say by way of an introduction is that I guess this paper is sort of moving the historical discussion, which is the focus of today's sessions, forward just a little bit in two ways. I mean, one is that I'll talk a bit about work from the 1960s and 1970s, so we're sort of moving forward there. But also, I make a lot about, or at least I want to make a lot about thinking about the second generation, or the kind of the students of emigre members of the Vienna Circle or of logical empiricism in general. And I'd be very, again, keen to hear about more work on that topic, because I think there, again, is a lot of promise in that area. All right, so with that, I'll kind of launch into the main body of the paper. And I want to start with a rough sketch of what I hope we can call the conventional narrative of the history of the philosophy of the social sciences after World War II. And in very general terms, this tends to turn on a contrast between naturalism or reductionism and a kind of anti-naturalism. So in the 1950s, the standard account of scientific explanation, of course, was the so-called Hempel-Oppenheim model. The earliest statement of this view, and we saw this paper in the readings in philosophical analysis, is Carl Gustav Peter Hempel's The Function of General Laws in History, which was published in the Journal of Philosophy as early as 1942. This was followed, as many of you know much better than me, I'm sure, by Hempel's canonical statement of the doctrine together with Paul Oppenheim in 1948. In the Hempel-Oppenheim model, an eventual regularity, the explanandum, is explained when it appears as the conclusion of a deduction from the explanans. And in turn, the explanans consists in two kinds of statements: descriptions of the event or regularity's antecedent conditions, and statements of general laws that cover or subsume the case at hand. Hempel and Oppenheim derived from this framework various logical and empirical conditions of adequacy for explanation. They also stressed that their formal model of explanation, and this is kind of key for what I want to say in the rest of this paper, they also stressed that this model was abstract enough to cover the explanation of human behavior and, of course, thinking about Hempel, historical events. But it's just here that the trouble begins. Hempel's theory, as this kind of standard story of the history of the philosophy of the social sciences goes, rapidly became a standing challenge to those who insisted that the intelligibility of human thought and action cannot be accommodated within the hypothetico-deductive model. Critiques of the Hempel-Oppenheim covering law model, very famously, were put forward by philosophers of history, such as William Drey, Arthur Danto, and Louis Mink in the 1950s and 1960s. And some of the debates around kind of the kind of critique of the Hempel-Oppenheim model and of naturalism in the social sciences in general were inspired in part by the steady drumbeat of publications from Wittgenstein's Nachlass over the same period in the 50s and 60s. These works showed how far Wittgenstein had gone in repudiating empirical or scientific explanations of human-mindedness. And the reception of the Nachlass formed the backdrop for a burgeoning literature on philosophical psychology. This work was most closely associated with the Routledge and Kegan-Paul series, Studies in Philosophical Psychologies, which by 1963 ran to 11 volumes, including, among many other important works, Peter Winch's seminal The Idea of a Social Science and Its Relation to Philosophy, which is still assigned, still in print, still taught in philosophy of social science courses to this day. Now, of course, as all of you know much better than me, I'm sure, these books sought to provide an elucidation of the key concepts of social inquiry, such as action, rationality, motivation, and the will, using kind of Wittgenstein's later philosophy. And Wittgensteinian philosophical psychology, as well as the post-positivist philosophy of science of Kuhn, Hansen, and Tolmin, encouraged a broader debate by the 60s and 70s about the limits of scientific naturalism. Okay, now all of this, as I say, is a very familiar story, a kind of textbook story about the history of the philosophy of social science after 1945. And it tends to set up what are by now standard accounts of the clash between different philosophical approaches to mind and action, right? We all kind of know these categories. Explanation versus understanding, reasons versus causes, positivism versus hermeneutics, objectivism versus relativism, choose your favorite dichotomy. However, I wanted to suggest, and this is kind of where this project on choice theory and philosophy kind of gets going, I want to suggest that these categories, in contrast, miss kind of a vitally important history. And it's a history also, it seems to me, in which some of the tools and methods of social inquiry, particularly rational choice theory, come to have an impact, as it were, speak back to philosophy. It's a two-sided dialogue that I think is worth looking at, but is sort of missed in the textbook account. And I'm going to spend the rest of my talk trying to kind of, begin to sketch out a rival or alternative account here. From as early as the 1960s, in fact, the attempt to integrate rational action into the general theory of explanation, of scientific explanation, produced a remarkable range of puzzles and conceptual inversions that drove some of the most able philosophical treatments of rational choice towards problems of normativity, value, psychology, metaphysics, and so on. What is more, many of these writers that I have in mind here worked closely with Hempel, Carnap, and Quine. So, I'm sure all of you kind of know who I have in mind, but I'm thinking of philosophers like Donald Davidson, Robert Nozick, Richard Jeffrey, and David K. Lewis. If I had slides right now, it would just be pictures of like Nozick and his amazing eyebrows. So you can just imagine that. But I do think, and Alan Gibbard, there are a number of people who are trained in this way, who are really important in post-war analytic philosophy. So look, in these brief remarks, in the time I have left for this paper, I can't do justice to the intricacies of these relationships. But I just want to begin to sketch them out. And if it seems worth pursuing, again, I'd be interested in getting people's views as to where I might take this. So to bring out the unusual career of rational choice theory in the post-war philosophy of social science, I just want to go back briefly to the covering law model. Now, an appealing feature of Hempel's approach was that it gave the problem of naturalism in the social sciences a clear structure. Folk explanations of action invoke the propositional attitudes, of course, beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on. Advocates of the covering law model argued that the explanation of action in terms of beliefs and desires was a form of causal explanation, and therefore did not violate the canons of scientific explanation. And indeed, Hempel himself in 1962 argued that rational choice explanations are compatible with the covering law model in a paper called Rational Action. Now, RCT, rational choice theory, is often known more simply as the expected utility theorem. As the advocates of this theorem never tire of repeating, and this is one of the things that in a way proves its bona fides as something that can be assimilated to a very abstract account of scientific explanation. What's been emphasized in treatments of the expected utility theorem is that to say that rational agents maximize their utility is, as Luce and Rafer put it in Games and Decisions, it's a tautology to say that. All that is needed to attribute a utility function to an agent is that their choices meet certain consistency conditions. Agents whose choices meet these conditions can be construed as having, first, complete sets of probability assignments over the prospective outcomes of actions, and second, consistent preferences over those options. No claim is made about what the utility function has to contain, or indeed how well informed the agent is. The only substantive claim of the theorem is that agents choose what they think best according to their own beliefs and desires, which are themselves not assessed for their correctness or legitimacy. Indeed, the purely formal definition of rationality embodied in the expected utility theorem, right? Agents choose what they think is best, is what makes it applicable not just to human beings, but to rats, pigeons, and selfish genes. This generality, I think, was one of the things that encouraged theorists of scientific explanation working under Hempel to suppose that decision theory was worth exploring as a framework for understanding human behavior. But they found very quickly that various qualifications and auxiliary assumptions were needed to make explanations of rational action fit Hempel's model. For example, and I'm going to move quickly just because I want to sketch out the terrain, but we could talk about this in the Q&A. Whether or not there are cases of genuine explanation in which we can identify an event's cause, but not a covering law, became, at least in the 60s and 70s, a delicate point in the philosophy of action and the philosophy of the social sciences more broadly. As Donald Davidson pointed out in Actions, Reasons, and Causes, published in '63, we can usually identify a cause of an action, namely an agent's reason for performing it, without being able to ground that reason in a general law. But it will remain, for Davidson, a causal explanation, and not, say, as many of the Wittgensteinians thought, a rationalization or mere redescription of that action. Davidson's reflections on the causal powers of beliefs and desires soon led him to an interest in the logical form of action sentences, which in turn stimulated his treatment of actions as events. And over time, this is into the 70s, into the mid-70s with Davidson, decision theory kind of shifts in his theory of interpretation from a kind of form of scientific explanation to one of the constitutive elements of rationality or the intelligibility of thought and action as such, alongside things like the propositional calculus and Tarski's truth theory. These all go together in what's been called Davidson's constitutive ideal of rationality. As the necessary conditions of the intelligibility of human speech and behavior as such, these logical schemas, like decision theory, become something like transcendental forms of any possible understanding, rather than freestanding theories or conceptual schemes. And this is one of the reasons why Jonathan Lear, in the early 80s, in a paper called Leaving the World Alone, describes Davidson as an idealist, which then gets taken up later by McDowell and others. Now, I am, of course, rushing through an extremely long and complex chain of argumentation. And my point in doing so is simply to stress that the meeting between decision theory, rational choice theory, and the received view of scientific theories very quickly generated a range of new, heterodox, and so it seems to me, not obviously positivistic or naturalistic accounts of the interpretation of human behavior and of human thought and action. It turns out, we might say, that the formal specification of rational action especially when it is in line with the most rigorous treatments of scientific explanation, leads to claims about rationality, cognition, and practical life that are as au courant with recent, even hermeneutic approaches in the human sciences as one could hope to find. The old naturalism versus anti-naturalism story with which I began this talk just doesn't take us very far. So to end, I want to sort of consider two examples. I realize I'm moving quickly here, but suggesting that like the students of Hempel could say things very similar to some of the more kind of outre, philosophy of social science that comes out of the hermeneutic turn in the 1970s. I think that's exactly what happens. And I want to try and give a couple of examples of how it does. Okay, so my first example is the philosophy of Robert Nozick. Again, imagine the eyebrows. Nozick wrote his dissertation, as some of you will know, at Princeton under the guidance of Hempel and Paul Benacerraf. It was filed in the fall of 1963 under the title of The Normative Theory of Individual Choice. Now, Nozick pursued several topics in his dissertation, more than I could possibly cover here, or indeed myself even adequately understand, but topics including the meaning of preference and indifference in decision theory, the normative conditions on choice in situations of certainty, risk, and uncertainty, and also von Neumann's solution for finite zero-sum two-person games in game theory. That's all kind of like, I'm kind of going through the chapters of Nozick's dissertation here. The general thrust of Nozick's study was decidedly negative. His basic conclusion was that there are no satisfactory theories of what one should choose, i.e. what one should do, in any of the various domains of decision theory. That's basically what its kind of negative project. There is, Nozick wrote in the conclusion to the dissertation, no adequate general normative theory of choice. All right, now on its own, this conclusion threatened to pull the rug out from under attempts to champion rational choice as an explanatory theory. So that's one thing that's coming out of this. But Nozick's diagnosis of a number of ambiguous or indeterminate aspects in choice theory also revealed some striking puzzles in the very concept of rational action itself, which is going to lead Nozick and others reading Nozick to make some claims that sound like hermeneutic method in social theory. All right, the most famous instance of one of these puzzles that Nozick discusses in the dissertation has become known as Newcomb's problem. Now, this problem was introduced to the world more generally in 1969, in a volume honoring Hempel. And it was posed by Nozick as follows. His summary is much better than anything I could come up with, so this won't take long, but in any case. Nozick's problem. Newcomb's problem involves a being who has the ability to predict the choices you will make. You have enormous confidence in the being's predictive ability. He has already correctly predicted your choices in many other situations and the choices of many other people in the situation to be described. We may imagine that the being is a graduate student from another planet, checking a theory of terrestrial psychology, who first takes measurements of the state of our brains before making his predictions. And then he puts in brackets, or we may imagine that the being is God. Graduate student, God, doesn't matter. Okay, so there are two boxes. Box 1 contains $1,000. Box 2 contains either $1 million or no money. Again, forgive me, this is familiar, I'm sure, to most of you. Now, you have a choice between two actions, right? Taking what is in both boxes or taking only what is in the second box. If the being predicts you will take what is in both boxes, he does not put the $1 million in the second box. If he predicts you will take only what is in the second box, he will put $1 million in that box. If he predicts you will base your choice on some random event, he does not put the money in the second box. You know these facts, he knows that you know them, and so on. This being makes his prediction of your choice, puts the 1 million in the second box or not, and then after that you choose. And of course, the question is, what do you do? Now, as is well known, the problem was designed to bring to light the conflict that, under certain situations, could emerge between two principles of rational choice. One is the expected utility theorem I mentioned earlier, choose so as to maximize expected utility. If we follow this principle, which is, after all, intended merely as a formal tautologous definition of rational choice, then it is rational to choose the second box only. Because we attach a very high probability to the being correctly predicting our choice, the highest expected utility to be derived from the choices we face is to select box 2. Our reasoning here is that the being will have predicted that this will be our choice and will therefore have put $1 million in the second box. However, this solution to the decision problem runs counter to the second logical principle of choice, namely the principle of strategic dominance, or L.J. Savage called the sure thing principle. This principle states that if a particular action is the best option in all possible worlds, then logically we should select it. Now, consider Newcomb's problem. At the time I make my choice, either to take both boxes or only the second box, the 1 million is either in box 2 or it is not. Nothing I do now can change what has already happened regarding the placement of the money. If I choose only the second box, I might get nothing, but we should discount that since I have a lot of faith in the being's predictive abilities. What is more relevant is that if I take both boxes, I'm guaranteed $1,000 and might receive, given that the money is in the second box or not already, $1,001,000. Whereas if I choose only the second box, I will either get $1,000 less than the million or nothing at all. So it follows from that, right, that taking both boxes is the best choice. It has the highest payoff in either scenario. Therefore, the principle of strategic dominance dictates that I take both boxes. Okay, now, before Nozick stated Newcomb's problem, the expected utility theorem and the dominance principle were widely assumed to be compatible with one another, each specifying different aspects of the formal logical conditions on choice. And then Newcomb's problem, as I understand it, was taken to show that that's wrong. And then the question is, which principle has priority in our considerations of the formal conditions on rational choice? And again, I won't go into this here, and this is, too much in the weeds and to some degree above my pay grade, but what Nozick wants to show is that each principle is kind of damaged by the thought experiment, or at least it can be. And he continues to write about this topic well into The Nature of Rationality, one of his last books. What I want to say about this is simply as follows. It's tempting to think that Newcomb's problem is nothing more than a brain teaser with no serious implications for real-world decision-making, or certainly any applicability in understanding social action as a social scientist might wish to understand that. And of course, the problem has been used to help clarify the stakes between causal and evidential approaches to decision theory. But I do think there is a kind of connection here between social theory and Newcomb's problem. As the French philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy has observed, Newcomb's problem bears on actually a pretty big problem here, a big question, which is the possibility of free will in a deterministic or providentially controlled universe. To follow the dominance principle and choose both boxes, Dupuy writes, is to embrace a fatalistic worldview. On this view, what has happened, and my choices cannot change that, since after all, I cannot undo what has already been done before. The future, i.e. my present, can have no causal effect on the past, obviously. Therefore, I should take both boxes and get as much utility as I can out of what fate or God or a graduate student has dealt me. However, this kind of fatalism can also strike us as irrational and indeed contrary to some of our deepest intuitions about human freedom and social action. And in fact, modern capitalism, at least according to Max Weber, was built in part on rejecting the fatalism of the dominance principle and adopting instead what looks like the wishful thinking of taking only the second box in Newcomb's problem. Now, if this rejection of fatalism sounds irrational or actually counterintuitive, it is nothing other, this is what Dupuy argues, than how Max Weber's Calvinists soothed their own anxiety over whether or not they were among the elect. Famously, Weber examined the origins of the Protestant work ethic exemplified by such nostrums as time is money and credit is money. How did the end of increasing one's wealth Weber asked, become a duty, as it had among the members of the Protestant sects in Europe and North America? It was this duty to accumulate wealth for its own sake that spurred the rationalization of labor, investment, and enterprise that Weber identified with the spirit of capitalism. We're talking about ideas that are at the center of modern social theory. Now, as Dupuy recognized, Weber's explanation for the sources of this duty to increase wealth was that the members of the Protestant sects found themselves, quite simply, in a Newcomb's problem. Whether or not they would receive grace was entirely predestined, foreordained by a transcendent and remote God. But this fact did not, for the most part, incline the Calvinists towards fatalism. They did not follow the principle of strategic dominance and conclude from the fact that, as they saw it, the fact of predestination, that it was better simply to be lazy and to enjoy one's earthly life as much as one could, on the assumption that one was already saved, in which case enjoy your life, or damned, in which case enjoy your life because you're already damned. Rather, they chose to give themselves signs that they were among the elect. Faced with what Weber described as the tremendous inner loneliness occasioned by the doctrine of predestination, pious Protestants made uncertainty over election endurable by acting as if they were among the elect. Since signs of election included success in worldly occupations, many Protestants devoted themselves methodically to ensuring that they were as successful as possible in their ventures. Insofar as they were successful, they could convince themselves that they had been saved, even though they knew they could never earn salvation by good works. They were, in a nutshell, choosing the second box by devoting themselves with the greatest possible care to a worldly calling that encouraged the belief that they had been predestined for salvation. So that's one route there, a kind of synergy between some of the problems emerging from rational choice theory and these deep questions about free will and social action that actually emerged in social theory. I have to conclude, so I'll be super brief about the last example, which is taken from another errant student of Hempel's who did a PhD at Princeton, and that's Richard C. Jeffrey. Like Nozick, Jeffrey completed his dissertation at Princeton under the direction of Hempel and Hilary Putnam, actually. I won't go through the details of Jeffrey's career, which of course include graduate work with Carnap at Chicago and teaching alongside Donald Davidson at Stanford. Instead, I just want to focus and say something brief to conclude about a later paper of Jeffrey's on probability as a theory of judgment. And what I'm driving at here, the point of this last example is what seems to me miraculous, and maybe those of you who are trained in rational choice theory will tell me this is sort of obvious, but what's striking to me is that Jeffrey comes to believe one of his closest allies in treating probability as a theory of judgment, and his what he calls his radical probabilism, one of his closest allies is Clifford Geertz and cultural anthropology. And he draws a direct analogy between his approach and an essay of Clifford Geertz's called Thick Description, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight, which is seen as one of the essays that launches the interpretive turn in the social sciences. And so I just want to say a word about how Jeffrey can possibly believe that he and Geertz, who are at Princeton at the same time, can make common cause. Jeffrey's comment comes in a set of remarks dissenting from Ian Hacking's famous account of the emergence of probability in his book of that name. Jeffrey takes issue with Hacking's famous argument that a quite specific event, quoting Hacking here, occurred around 1660, the emergence, as Hacking says, of our concept of probability, namely a dual concept having to do both with stable frequencies and with degrees of belief. Now, on the contrary, Jeffrey's thesis, the essay of his is called Probability and the Art of Judgment. Jeffrey's thesis is that probability must be understood as a theory of judgment, and in that sense, as a rival to both dogmatist and skeptical doctrines. And for Jeffrey, as a theory of judgment, probability includes both the frequency and the subjective interpretations together. There isn't quite the split that Hacking imagines. With the revolution in theories of judgment at the center of the story, says Jeffrey, The specific event that occurred around 1660 was just the emergence of betting at odds as the paradigm of all action, within which probabilizing replaces believing. More concretely, Jeffrey sees the 17th century emergence of probability as a fission of the concept of approval, i.e. judgments of what sensible persons in similar circumstances would believe about the probability of a proposition, the fission of the concept of approval into judgmental probability and judgmental desirability or utility, with the second element, says Jeffrey, coming into view only later with Frank Ramsey's essay, Truth and Probability. The probabilists recognized the difficulties, according to Jeffrey, with the dogmatist attempts to extend their absolutist either-or conception of belief as acceptance to merely approvable beliefs, and made approval a matter of judgmental probability. Okay, so here's where Goetz comes in, right? Because Jeffrey says, well, look, there's this historical story we can tell about what happens around 1660, and he thinks it's the birth of this kind of view of probability as a theory of judgment, a general theory of approvability. But then Jeffrey says, well, so you can tell this story that all of those Bielefeld historians of statistics and probability are telling, Rainey Daston, Ian Hacking, Ted Porter, and others, which is about Europe, or you can just read Goetz's essay, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight, and find an example of exactly what I'm saying. So let me talk about that. So Jeffrey insists that kind of cagey betting, as he calls it, right, betting at odds sufficient to induce someone to gamble, was by no means new to early modern Europe, or unique to it. He conjectures that the ties of solidarity and community have long strained against more individualistic, competitive betting. There is a great difference, he writes, between the supportive sort of bet, through which you demonstrate solidarity with a cause or opinion by betting on it so as to embrace its fate, and the cagey Damon Runyon sort, where you pit your judgment against others by fine-tuning of odds. In Runyon's world, only a chump would back a team out of party loyalty. The shrewd bettor follows his judgment, not his heart. Jeffrey then observes that this judgmental betting, while common in Pascal's Paris, was probably not new to Europe, and was probably not particularly Indo-European either. And he cites Goetz's essay, Deep Play, as evidence. Goetz, he writes, gives a fascinating account of an entrenched, seemingly indigenous institution of cagey betting in Bali, where two kinds of bets have names and definite places around the cockpit. And he quotes the following passage from Goetz's essay, and with this I promise I'm done. There are two sorts of bets. This is Goetz. There are two sorts of bets, or TOH, T-O-H. There is the single axial bet in the center between the principals, to ketenga, and there is the cloud of peripheral ones around the ring between members of the audience, to kasasi. The first is typically large, the second typically small. The first is collective, involving coalitions of bettors clustering around the owner. The second is individual, man to man. The first is a matter of deliberate, very quiet, almost furtive arrangement by the coalition members and the umpire huddled like conspirators in the center of the ring. The second is a matter of impulsive shouting, public offers, and public acceptances by the excited throng around the edges. And most curiously, where the first is almost always, without exception, even money, the central bet on the cockfight, the second, equally without exception, is never such. About this scene, Jeffrey concludes that in Balinese terms, the native ground of the new paradigm, i.e. the paradigm of judgmental betting, new in the 17th century as a model of judgment, is the periphery. Probabilism's paradigmatic act is the judgmental bet, to kisasi, says Jeffrey. Jeffrey's own view of judgment and belief, which he called radical probabilism, is, he says, the logic of the to kisasi. Goetz's essay, as I've said, launched a hermeneutic revolution in the social sciences. It's in this famous book called The Interpretation and the Social Sciences, which went through 2 editions, and is seen as very much a post-positivist work. But as Gertz himself understood, he was kind of met in making some of these arguments about how betting, the cultural meaning of betting in Bali, can be met by work in decision theory. There's actually a footnote in that essay on basically how it would be helpful to have decision theorists study the cockfight in Bali for anthropologists. And all I've been trying to say is that these synergies between kind of post-Hempelian philosophy of science and social theory, which I've sketched in a quick and in lots of ways unrigorous way, I just think they're not as well understood as they could be and maybe should be. And my remarks have tried to throw a little bit of light on those connections. So thank you for listening.
Just thank you, Brian Roberts speaking. Regarding the role of axiomatic representation theorems and expected utility, you characterized this in various moments as a sort of element of rationality and common behavior for many people. How should we then think about the many behaviors, even big group behaviors, that appeal to other decision principles, minimax regret, maximin, Pareto, alpha, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And what to make of those? I mean, many of them do have themselves axiomatic representation theorems associated with them, but then the situation starts to look less like rationality and more like various ways of modeling different sorts of behaviors.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's something I need to grapple with. So what do I want to say about that? It does seem to me that from philosophers, the expected utility theorem encounters like heavy weather, like pretty early, right? And there are lots of criticisms and amendments to that basic paradigm, which I think it would be important and helpful for me in this project to trace. And so although I kind of start there because the expected utility theorem is important to the kind of first wave of trying to bring rational choice theory into the philosophy of social science, from there the story gets a lot more complicated. And maybe the last thing I want to say about that is, I would want to bring in, the question is, which thinkers would be most useful for kind of tracing the kinds of complications that you describe. And at least one person I think would be helpful on that score would be Jan Elster, because he actually begins as a fairly kind of, as it were, straight down the line, defender of the theory of rational choice. And by the time you get to the last edition of Explaining Social Behavior, which was published maybe 5 or 6 years ago, his account of rational choice, cites 3 optimality conditions and allows for a much richer and more complicated conception of rational action. And so I think maybe following him would be a way of trying to integrate some of those different theorems and some of those different models that you described. That's what I would say. But thanks for the question. That's helpful.
This was really interesting. Lots of really interesting interconnections. So when you mentioned Jeffrey and then Gertz, you had been talking about the Calvinists who were, so to speak, betting on sort of lifestyle for social and sort of psychological reasons in a way that on some accounts would seem irrational. So I thought you were going to go somewhere else with the reference to Gertz. So one of the things that you didn't mention is in the cockfight betting. I don't remember. I think this was on the peripheral bets. I'm not sure. Maybe it was the center bets. But one of the sort of factors that Gertz talks about is that the bets express loyalty and friendship. And so, if you bet in a way that's rational, but you're betting against some family that you're supposed to be allied with, that can lead to sort of a long period of discord. So I'm just sort of thinking about, well, maybe in practice, there's a lot of betting behavior or life choice behavior that's expressive and not sort of oriented toward immediate payoffs, and
Yeah.
that's all.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree more. A couple of things about that. I mean, one of the things that Jeffrey is describing about the rise of judgmental betting, I kind of touched on it briefly just at the end, is, I mean, it's what's really fascinating about this is, like, in terms of where Jeffrey gets in his radical probabilism, is he's describing what, you know, in the 18th century would be called a sociability theory, sort of saying we have these strains of, you know, of loyalty to kin, to society, to community, that go alongside this kind of Damon Runyon, like, betting on this very individualistic form. I think what Goethe says in that essay is it's the central bet that defines loyalty. Like, the central bet on this or that cock is the one that you say, well, of course, we as a unit, we as a family, we are backing our bird. But then what you can do, often very furtively, says Goetz, when you kind of stand back and wait for the fight, is make a deal with someone who's calling odds that actually goes against the bet you made on behalf of, you know, that particular cock, right? And people would, if you got found out doing that, there would be shame for you for doing that. But people, I mean, many people did that, right? So you see these kinds of strains. And that's important to Goetz because he doesn't want to fall back into a kind of nostalgia or like primitivism in which, like, you know, you would say all quote unquote traditional societies are marked by the ties of Gemeinschaft rather than Gesellschaft. Because Goetz is saying, no, it's there all the time. And you can see it in the cockfight. That's why that essay, that case study is so important. So then just the last thing about betting being expressive. So Nozick, when he writes later on Newcomb's problem, he noticed, because he would run experiments with his students in class, right? And he would say, if you change the amount of money that goes into the second box, the one that you can't see, people would actually switch from following the expected utility principle to the dominance principle or vice versa. And he said, so it really depends. Like, people have lots of criteria before they, if they need to, choose one principle or the other. And as he thought more about this, he developed this notion that he called symbolic utility. And so, I mean, which I think sort of your last comment captures quite well, that he thinks a lot of rational choice, even so-called utility maximizing behavior, has this expressive dimension, which is absolutely critical to understanding social action, which again, I would say that's already talking I mean, once you're talking the language of symbolic action, you're talking the language of interpretive social science in a way that you might not expect to get there from students of Hempel, but I think that you do in many cases.
So we're already over time, so a very, very short question and a very, very short answer.
Okay.
This could be promissory. I was wondering if you, in your work on this, had been able to tie it to some of the work we heard this morning, especially around funding through the NSF. The first thing they fund is, of course, decision theory in the social behavioral sciences, or through RAND.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. So I need to be brief. Yes, those connections are there. The one case study, so the one person I've done the most work on so far is Davidson. And I have a chapter in a book coming out which looks at how he brings together semantics and decision theory in his theory of interpretation. But Stanford was the place in which you couldn't have a sustainable department without huge contracts from the Office of Naval Research and other places. And so projects on decision theory and value theory floated the boat through Patrick Suppies as well as Davidson of the philosophy department in Stanford through the 50s. So those connections are definitely there. Thank you for that question.
Let's thank Joe Whitting.